I want to thank you, Phil, for asking me. I'm just flattered out of my socks almost to think that I have anything to contribute to this series of lectures. And I want to thank you for the opportunity of appearing in a courtroom so that I can practice up, and maybe when I grow up I can be Marcia Clark. And Your Honor, I do not plan to use any argumentative statements. What is history? I know what some of you are going to say. History is boring. And I know what you mean. I, too, thought it was boring. In fact, when I went to college, it was only necessary for me to go 2 years to be certified to teach in the elementary schools in Indiana at that time. And we were required to take one history course in that 2 years. Before we graduated with a degree, we had to take 2 more. And I made up my mind, if I never went back and finished my degree, I was never going to take those 2 history courses. Would you believe I did graduate? And by the time I'd finished my master's degree, I had a minor in history. My dictionary, which is almost as old as I am, had 2 definitions for history. One of them is it is the branch of knowledge of the past. And the second one is, it is the record of past events, especially in connection with the human race. Now, I like that second definition best because it talks about people. And it's the people that I'm interested in. It's the people that makes the event so interesting. I like to know why our forefathers came and settled in particular places, and then the events followed along after that. I'm especially interested in the people who came to live in Jasper County. What brought the settlers to Jasper County? Usually transportation has a big important part. And transportation meant in those days rivers. We do have 2 navigable rivers in Jasper County. You're going to hear a lot about the Kankakee later, and you probably question about whether the Iroquois is navigable. But as I understand it, a river is navigable as far as it can be traveled in a canoe. And this is still true, or so I've been told. The Iroquois starts just north of Rensselaer and a little west. Just comes out of the ground, makes almost a complete circuit around Rensselaer, and travels on into Illinois, and then travels north again and hits the Kankakee in Illinois, and it travels down to the Illinois River and then eventually to the Mississippi. It is almost impossible to get out of Rensselaer without crossing the Iroquois River. If you're on College Avenue and you want to start south, you have to cross the river. If you're downtown and you want to go west, you have to cross the river. If you want to go north, you have to cross the river about 5 miles north of town. If you want to go east, you go out to the Gang-Off Bridge and you cross the river. And even if you wanted to go west by going south out of Rensselaer and then heading west by Mount Calvary Cemetery, you have to cross the river. We know that the Kankakee was large enough to travel on, but the Iroquois is pretty small, especially in Rensselaer. Its source is just north and a little west of town. Some of the early settlers did come here because of the river, but they didn't travel here in a canoe. Some of the early settlers settled along the rivers, and they were kind of like the Indians who Bob mentioned, that they settled along the rivers because of the game and the fish. Another factor that brought people to Jasper County was the promise of rich soil. But I am inclined to think that because this part of Indiana opened for settlement in 1832 was the drawing card which brought most people here. They were looking for an opportunity to get their hands on some good, cheap land. The county was described as a gently rolling prairie of dark, gloomy soil in the southwestern part. That's down around Remington. In the northern and northeastern part, the soil was sandy. But the pioneers cultivating the land brought many changes, making it into a pleasant rolling prairie of thrifty farms. Now you're going to wonder why I said that the north part of the county was sandy when we know that it was swampy up there. Well, I think perhaps this would be a good time to mention how the county was formed. In 1834 and 35, the Indiana legislature formed Jasper County, which was to include all of Benton County, plus Carpenter Township, Jordan Township, and most of Marion and Newton, and the southern part of Newton County. So you can see that from our map up here that this was Jasper County, but it went clear over to the Illinois state line. And Benton County, down here. Newton County was formed at the same time, and it included the north part of the county. So our Newton and Jasper County line, instead of going north and south in those days, went east and west and cut our county in two as well as Newton County. And Newton County even took in a part of Lake and Porter counties north of the river. And in 1836, Porter County was formed, and in 37, Lake County was formed, and that took care of the land north of the river. Now, Jasper County had been sort of attached to White County. I don't know what that meant, but apparently they had some jurisdiction over the settlement of the county. But in 1838, Jasper County was organized as a separate county, but it was still combined with Newton County. And then in 1839, they turned that around and we became two separate counties, pretty much as we are now. Except for Benton County. And then in 1840, Benton County was formed, and through our negotiations in forming Benton County, we got Milroy Township out of it. So that kind of explains why the early description of the land said that the northern part of the county was sandy. One of the things most feared by the early settlers was the almost yearly occurrence of prairie fires. After the first frost around the 1st of October, the fires broke out and continued until the surrounding prairie all burned, or until the green grass in the spring had grown sufficiently to halt the progress of the flames. I remember when almost every summer there would be a muck fire. How many of you remember the muck fires? They were kind of hard to put out. In fact, I guess they just let them burn themselves out. The land in the neighborhood of the little town of Newland was made up of muck land. I guess muck is the result of peat moss deteriorating, and I guess when put under pressure it eventually turned into coal. Anyway, it will burn, and this became a problem. The twin counties of Jasper and Newton were formed in 1835. They were named for the Revolutionary War soldiers who fought side by side. Although the counties were formed, it was not possible to purchase land here until 1837. They had to wait until the land had been surveyed. The first settler within the present limits of Jasper County was a man named William Donahue. He was attracted by the same thing that the Indians were attracted to our county for, the abundance of fur-bearing animals. He came to what is now Gillum Township as early as 1832. He settled near the banks of the Pinkemink, which is a little tributary of the Iroquois. And I know that the beavers still build dams on the Pinkemink, right? He stayed there, and he became very active in the county development and in the politics of the county, but after his death, his family left. The next settlement was made at the Falls of the Iroquois. Perhaps it would seem funny to say that the Iroquois had enough drop in it to make a falls. The early name for the Iroquois was the Rockwise, and we find references to the rapids of the Rockwise. rapids or falls, the location eventually became Rensselaer. Joseph Yeoman, his wife Sarah, Sarah's father John Knowles, and her brother David Knowles came here in 1834 from Buncombe, Illinois. Buncombe is now called Iroquois. Their original home was in Kentucky. They lived for a while in Ohio and then in Fountain County, Indiana, where Mrs. Knowles died. While living in Buncombe, they heard of the falls and decided to investigate the land with the idea of making it their home. John, Joseph, and David, following the Buncombe trace along the Iroquois River, stopped at the falls and decided to lay claim to the land on the east side of the river. It was here that they started their cabin. The cabin was built about where the Washington Street Bridge is today. David returned to Buncombe with a wagon and an oxen and moved their possessions and his sister to their chosen spot. The four of them erected their cabin and were soon in it. This must have been a lonesome existence for this family. On one occasion, Mrs. Yeoman was left alone in the cabin while the men went for supplies. She saw a band of Potawatomi Indians along the river near the cabin. She suddenly became aware that they were approaching the cabin, and although she was frightened, she answered the summons to the door. She had been baking cornbread, and they smelled it. They offered to exchange some of their catch for some of her bread. They must have developed a friendship for these Indians because in later years, David Knowles recalled that being the first white child to come to this area, his only playmates were the Indians, for he was only 12 years old at the time. The Yeomans were soon joined by a Mr. Charles Wright, who came from White County. His original idea was to establish an Indian trading post. He had left his family in White County and moved in with the Yeomans for a time, but he later built his own cabin. In 1834, Thomas Randall and George Culp came and settled near the fork of the Pinkhamink and the Iroquois just east of Rensselaer. This was known as the Fork Settlement and included a wide area extending from Marion Township into Hanging Grove and Barclay Townships, and they were all considered a part of this settlement. The Parkinsons and the Barclays came to Barclay Township. John Parkinson was married to a daughter of Simon Kenton, the Indian scout who traveled with Daniel Boone and was said to have saved his life at one time. Simon refused to come to Jasper County, but upon his death, his wife, Elizabeth Jarboe Kenton, came to live with the Parkinsons and died here and is buried in a family cemetery on the farm. This farm also served as a station for the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. Now, I could go on and on about these families, but before I quit, I want to mention the David Fegley family, who came about this same time and established himself east of town. He made a part of his living by catching fish and drying them, and then grinding them into meal. Of course, like I mentioned last week, when the Dutch came to DeMont, they brought their churches. The churches were established in Jasper County almost immediately. The first church to be established in Jasper County was the Methodist Episcopal Church. On October 22nd, 1833, at a conference held in Madison, Indiana, Bishop Armstrong appointed Enoch Wood to the Delphi circuit. This circuit was to include the Fork Settlement. This was known as the Iroquois Mission and was to serve not only the white settlers, but the Indians of the area. The first meetings were held in homes. Not until 1850 did they have a building. The first class leader was George Culp, who took the role of guiding the flock. For the next 10 years, the Methodists were very busy establishing congregations in many of the small communities in Jasper County. Of course, they were soon followed by the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the Catholics. Now, the coming of the Van Rensselaers. Joseph Yeoman developed a farm near his cabin where Rensselaer is today. He cleared and cultivated his claim without fear of near neighbors for 2 years. Mr. William Malat located his cabin across the river from Mr. Yeoman. I would guess somewhere in the neighborhood of Milroy Park. Mr. Yeoman was determined to establish a village here. The county seat had been moved here from its original location south of what is Brooke, Indiana. This was then called Newton. Until after the land had been surveyed in 1837, land could not be bought here, and settlers made a claim to the land by simply building a home and cultivating the land with the idea that they would lay a claim officially later. This both Yeoman and Mullatt did. However, at that time, the government, in order to discharge certain obligations to individuals, granted a warrant for a prescribed amount of land to be located at the option of the holder of the warrant on any land belonging to the United States. And the United States had acquired this land from the Indians in 1832. Well, along came Mr. Van Rensselaer and Mr. William Kenton, each in possession of just such a document, which was called a float. Mr. Van Rensselaer decided that the land Mr. Yeoman had improved was just what he wanted, and Kenton took possession of the land on which Mr. Mullatt had settled. The fact that Mullatt and Yeoman had not officially registered their claims made it possible for the Van Rensselaers and the Kentons to assume ownership of this land. There is no record of either one of them ever paying $1 for the land. Mr. Van Rensselaer had been a merchant in Utica, New York. He had suffered losses in the Panic of 1837. He brought what money he could salvage and came west to repair his fortune. And he found himself in possession of a good farm, considerably cultivated and partially fenced. Mr. Van Rensselaer proceeded to draw up the original plat of the town of Newton on June the 12th, 1839. It would seem that the growth of the town of Newton was assured. But that hard-nosed Dutchman, who had been rather high and mighty ideas about the value of the land that he possessed, he set out to sell the lots. The first one he sold was to, can you guess who? Joseph Yeoman. That's correct. Joseph Yeoman paid him $100 for the plot. But the rest of the sales went rather slowly. Trying to sell lots for more than they are worth slowed down the growth of the town. He did develop a mill on the river in 1838, or perhaps it was 1839. It was a combined saw and grist mill. In 1844, the name of the town was changed to Rensselaer. James died March the 12th, 1847, and is buried in the Presbyterian churchyard. He left not only his name on the town, but he modestly named several streets after members of his family. We, of course, have Van Rensselaer Street, Susan Street after his wife and daughter, Angelica after his great-grandmother, Rutson after his grandmother, Cornelia Rutson, Cullen Street after his wife's family. Their daughter Susan was married to Henry Weston, so we have Weston Street. And incidentally, the Westons moved into the cabin that the Yeomans built. The Westons had a baby that died, and he is also buried in the churchyard beside his grandfather. People often ask if there's any connection between Rensselaer, Indiana and Rensselaer, New York, and the answer is yes. Both towns were originally settled by descendants of Hendrik van Rensselaer of Holland. Rensselaer, New York recently celebrated a refurbishing of their community and published a book in which they state that Hendrik more or less engineered the development of that area. And our James Van Rensselaer was a descendant of his. The Van Rensselaers came from Amsterdam. Their early ancestor was a man named Kilian Van Rensselaer, and he was a diamond merchant. And he was able to purchase in 1630 700,000 acres on both sides of the Hudson River around Albany, New York. And we could trace the genealogy of our James, but unless your name is Van Rensselaer, I don't suppose you'd be interested in that. Now, by 1858, there was an effort to incorporate the town. An election was held for this purpose by the commissioners, but the enthusiasm for the project waned. The Civil War came along and the charter was allowed to lapse. In 1866, the incorporation was revised through the efforts of Simon P. Thompson. From then on, things began to happen. Simon Parr Thompson, along with 4 of his brothers, David, Alfred, Thomas, and Isaac, came here from Ohio with the idea of establishing a bank. With them came Alfred McCoy, and I believe Alfred McCoy was Alfred Thompson's brother-in-law. Simon and David established a law office, and Alfred and Alfred McCoy established the bank. And it survived, and after a number of changes, it is now known as First of America. Alfred and Simon each built imposing homes, which stand today as testimony to their success and influence in Rensselaer. They are both built of brick, and no amount of huffing and puffing by the elements or the citizens of Rensselaer have succeeded in blowing them down. And so, like the third little pig, who also built his house of bricks, they survived, and we can see them today. One of them is on Gray Street by the bridge, and is the house in which Judge McGraw now lives. The other is on Park Avenue between Washington and Grove Street. Each one had what to me was a fascinating feature. Simon's, the one on Gray Street, had a flowing well in the yard. And it is said that on Sunday afternoons, the citizens of the town would take their drinking cups down there and spend the afternoon socializing and drinking fresh spring water. Alfred's house on Park Avenue has a widow's walk on top. Alfred used to go up there and watch his son DeLoss ride the horse in from their farm, which was east of town about 2 miles. I think this would be a good time for me to tell you a little about the women, especially Mrs. Alfred Thompson. She was some heck of a lady. She was the daughter, was the sister, I think, of Alfred McCoy. She had been in Philadelphia attending a centennial celebration, and while there, she participated in a convention sponsored by the influential women of the country, including Susan B. Anthony. When she returned to Rensselaer, she spoke so enthusiastically of the meetings that on Thanksgiving Day in 1877, at a dinner party given by Mary Ellen, it was decided to organize a ladies' literary society. Their motto was spiritual improvement. The membership was limited to wives of merchants, attorneys, physicians, and farmers who were gifted with the talent of good housekeeping in all departments, and with some an exceptional knowledge of music and art. They met once a week and originally provided their own programs. For 2 years, they studied Shakespeare. They often had debates with such topics as women's colleges should be abolished, dancing is a harmless sport, a law should be passed requiring parents to keep their children in school from ages 6 to 16. They once rented an apartment above one of the stores on Washington Street where they could meet. They needed furniture for it. They heard that Colonel John Van Rensselaer, son of James, was going to visit the town, and they thought they would invite him to speak, and if he was impressed with the group, he might give them the money they needed to furnish their place. He came dressed in a very dudeish manner with nose glasses and a buttonhole bouquet. He carried a gold-headed cane and wore sideburns which were trimmed to a frazzle. This is the way it was reported in the minutes of the Ladies' Literary Society. He rose with great dignity with a package in his hand. The women all thought that he was going to give them a gift that would make it possible for them to purchase the furniture at last. He spoke in a very complimentary way, and they all listened with great anticipation. When he opened the package, it contained 3 or 4 dozen pictures of himself, one for each one of the ladies. Needless to say, the ladies were crestfallen and really didn't know what to do, so one of them impulsively jumped up and made a motion that they make him an honorary member, which they did. The following week, they read a paper as a part of the program, and in the paper was this poem. V stands for Van Rensselaer, so spare and so thin, the only male member we could ever take in. He is honorary too, but is deficient in flesh. We scarcely expect him to get back to this place. Their programs were always criticized, and the critic on this endeavor said that it lacked something, but she would accept it. These women entered into any activity that would make the town a better place. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter Ora were very influential in getting the town to buy the land now known as Milroy Park, and in collecting funds to have the monument put there. The sculptor was a Rensselaer girl by the name of Mary Ellen Washburn. They occasionally held evening meetings inviting the public, and they charged admission. On one such occasion, they invited James Whitcomb Riley to speak. He was to arrive on the train at 7 o'clock. The train was so late that everybody went home. Later, the train and Mr. Riley did arrive. They rang the fire bell, and everyone returned to hear Mr. Riley recite some of his poems. The Ladies' Literary Society is still functioning today after 117 years. It is the oldest organization of its kind in the state of Indiana. Now we're going to go down to Remington. Last week we mentioned that I think Larry asked that he saw Remington, or Carpenter asked on the map, and he wanted to know if it was Carpenter Station, and that is indeed what it was called. Remington is encircled by Carpenter's Creek, which eventually flows into the Iroquois west of Rensselaer. Remington was originally known as Carpenter Station, as I mentioned, and it was named after an old hunter by the name of Carpenter, who came each season in the early 1830s. One extremely cold winter, he froze to death and was buried on a high cliff on the south side of the creek, about 1 mile from Remington. The exact location of his burial place is unknown because the marker was lost years ago. In 1836, John Jordan came to Carpenter Township and made a land claim. He is said to have been the first settler in Carpenter Township. Jesse H. Fordyce, who in the late 1850s owned the land where Remington is now, promised a railroad company every other plat of land out of 20 plats if they would complete a switch at Carpenter Station. On January the 1st, 1860, the Logansport, Peoria, and Burlington Railroad ran the first train through the land provided for them. And so that was our first railroad in Jasper County. On July the 27th, 1860, the town was platted. There were about 10 houses, and a Mr. George B. Clark built the first store. In 1861, the name of the town was changed to Remington after William Remington, who was a friend of Mr. Fordyce. Remington had built the second store in Remington. In 1869, the town was incorporated under the name of Remington. The Chautauqua Movement began in 1874 and swept the country. By 1909, there were some 103 local Chautauquas in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt observed that the Chautauqua was the most American thing in America. Jasper County is indeed fortunate to have one of the very few Chautauquas in existence today. It is located about 2 miles north of Remington. It all started when Mr. Robert Parker purchased the land and saw the natural beauty as an ideal place for an annual assembly for the people of this area to meet and discuss religious, scientific, and literary subjects. He set aside 30 acres for this purpose. His plan was to build a beautiful fountain, and the plat was given the name of Fountain Park. He did erect a tabernacle that would seat 1,000 people. The first 10-day event was arranged in 1895. Mr. Parker paid all the expenses, which amounted to $1,500. Visitors that year pitched tents and had groceries delivered from Remington. Cottages have since been built, and there is a 35-room hotel which is open only during the 2-week Chautauqua period. The original tabernacle was replaced in 1959. This building seats 600. The association is having the seats recovered and repaired at the present time, getting ready for their centennial this coming summer. U.S. Senator John J. Ingalls opened the first session with his famous lecture, The Perils of the Republic. That could be a title for a lecture today, couldn't it? Since then, many prominent persons have appeared on the programs of the park. Among them, we find William Jennings Bryan and Billy Sunday. More recently, Paul Harvey spoke at several of their annual meetings. Now I want to talk a little about railroads, and the question was brought up last week about when the railroad was built across from Wheatfield to DeMont and so on. And so I have this to report. In 1883, the 3I Railroad was built through Wheatfield and DeMont and all points in between, including Dunsville and Stoutsburg. This brought hunters and others in, but more importantly, transported local produce to markets in Chicago and elsewhere. Baggage cars were filled with milk cans, chickens and ducks in crates, dressed livestock, and a variety of wild game. In winter, dressed rabbits were covered with water and frozen. In summer, they were salted down before shipping. An important item was that they baled swamp hay, which they sold in Chicago for $8 a ton. Passenger service was also important. People used the railroad for shopping trips, and in 1908, a round-trip 12-day excursion from Wheatfield to Niagara Falls could be made for $7.20. Another railroad that we didn't mention last week, connecting Wheatfield to the outside world, was Old Coley, built in 1879. The major purpose of this line was to haul coal. It ran from Wheatfield to Fair Oaks in this county. It was the Chicago, Attica, and Southern Railroad when it went out of business in 1949. And we have Wheatfield up here, and we have Fair Oaks down, I think it's in here. Fair Oaks down here. And the Monon Railroad then went through Rensselaer and up through Fair Oaks. So Fair Oaks was really quite a hub of activity with the railroads there. Now, as I said, Remington's road was the only one we had early in our history. And we do have an account in General Milroy's diary that he went to Remington to take the cars to Louisville during the Civil War. As early as 1852, some effort was made to establish a railroad through Rensselaer, but finances at the time killed the project. In 1870 and 71, the scheme was revived, and although the proposed product did not ever materialize, it became evident that there was a need for such a project. By late 1877, under the leadership of Alfred McCoy, R.S. Dwiggins, and Ira W. Yeoman, the amount of $30,000 was raised. This was to be known as the Indianapolis, Delphi, and Chicago Railroad. It was divided into 8 sections. Rensselaer figured in the third section, which took in the route from Rensselaer to the town of Bedford. Now you're thinking of Bedford, Indiana, down in the south, but we had a Bedford over in White County, now is called Monon. The name Bedford was later changed to Monon. Bedford already had a line from Louisville to Michigan City, and we have an account that Grandpa George Morgan returned from the Civil War, and he rode to Bedford by rail and walked the rest of the way home about 20 miles. Grandpa George Morgan was our last Civil War hero. He lived until 1949. Another interesting fact about this railroad is that, and this was mentioned last week, that Lincoln's funeral train passed through Bedford on its way to Chicago, going to Michigan City and then west to Chicago. On Thursday, February the 14th, 1878, Rensselaer celebrated the completion of this third division with a barbecue, a free excursion on the road, and an enthusiastic meeting. Mr. McCoy furnished the fatted ox for the occasion. It weighed 834 pounds. It was estimated that 2,000 people attended the festivities. The entire 8 divisions were completed by early summer of 1883. Rensselaer at one time had 14 passenger trains stopping here, 7 each way. The first from Chicago to Indianapolis was at 2:30 in the morning. and the last from Chicago to Louisville at 11:30 at night. This eventually became known as the Monon line and was sometimes called the college line because students used it to go to and from Indiana University, DePaul, Wabash, Purdue, and of course St. Joe. The need for this rail service tapered off as far as passengers were concerned until in 1957 it ran its last train. The old brick depot stood empty and was the victim of deterioration and vandalism and was torn down in 1980. Strangely enough, Amtrak returned passenger service to Rensselaer that very same year. There are those who long for the days of the warm depot instead of that hut that stands down there now. Another railroad project, although not as extensive but equally as interesting, and this was mentioned last week too, is the line built by Mr. Benjamin Gifford. In 1891, he purchased from the Thompson brothers 6,700 acres of swampland in Jasper County for $4.50 an acre. This was some of that muckland that I mentioned before. He constructed a dredge boat and went to work. He drained his land and brought in tenant farmers to work in it. It was good onion, potato, and mint land. His dream was to provide service to the farmers of Jasper County for the purpose of shipping their produce to Chicago. He received his charter September the 10th, 1898. He was able to complete 36 miles of it from McCoysburg to Dinwiddie in Lake County. And McCoysburg is, I found it a little while ago, I think right in here. And then it went up through, and it went through a lot of little towns, Lewistown, Davisonville, Moody, you name it. There are a whole bunch of them that are gone now. All right. A new oil field was discovered in Jasper County in 1900, and Mr. Gifford quickly extended the spur line to a community known as Asphaltum. In 1901, the Gifford Road had 2 locomotives, a combination car, 7 box cars, 9 flat, and 2 tank cars. From June the 10th, 1912 to June the 30th, 1913, they carried 869 passengers and hauled 25,895 tons of freight. With the passing of Mr. Gifford came the demise of the Gifford Road. It drew its last corporate breath March the 15th, 1914. And now I'd like to stop for a little bit, and we're going to take a break at this time. Before we do, I'm going to ask Judge McGraw to tell us a little about the courtroom, and then I'm going to ask Ken Brooks to take any of you people who want to go down as far down in the courthouse to the basement. It's quite interesting down there, but it's a long way, and the stairway is not too hazardous, but it's a little hard to get up and down. Take it from me, I know. Then you people that would like to tour that part, go with Ken. The rest of you, as soon as the judge gets finished, can go to the second floor and to the first floor, and the officers are going to be there. I'm going to do a minute. And they will have some things to show you. They've gotten out some of their documents and some of their older things, and I think you'll be interested in seeing those officers. Bill?
Okay. When we watch the exam, we break. The refreshment from the jury room, before you start taking your room, grab yourself something, drink something, you can take it with you, because then when the tours are all over, we come back and Beulah will finish up. The courtroom that you're sitting in today is the smaller of the 2 courtrooms because the hallway is behind here. If you notice this, they take off the hallway off this courtroom. It's the only difference in the 2 courtrooms. The other courtroom sits exactly across. Both benches now face each other. We remodeled, when Judge Caney was the judge, he and I remodeled the 2 courtrooms. This one had no material changes in it from when it existed at the beginning of the century, except that this bench had been moved to that wall, and this was used as a library. At the time we began the remodeling project, the rosettas you see on the walls here had little copper lights on them with little milkshade hoods, and those are all in stores someplace around the county. Yet they still exist, I don't know. They took those down and we plugged the holes because the lighting was insufficient. We redid the lighting. Now in the outer lobby there was a great big copper chandelier. That chandelier hung right here in the middle of the courtroom. And since the other courtroom did not have one, and we're not sure where it went, it obviously had one at one time. But during some remodeling project, you notice they lowered the ceiling in the courtroom. That disappeared, or is it somewhere? I don't know. But that one is hanging in the lobby, hung right in the center of the courtroom. When we moved this bench, the back wall still had the original paintings. There wasn't wallpaper at that time. So to decorate the walls, they would paint them. And those are still underneath that wallpaper. The commissioners, for the 100-year anniversary, are redoing everything in the courthouse. As you notice, some of the paint is peeling. That's because the old ceilings that had the old enamel type old paint on it was gone over with latex, and you can see what happens. It doesn't stick, it just falls off. So all that's going to be redone. And I don't know if they plan on putting the colors back in all the decorations on the side. Those are all painted with different colors. The greenery, the draperies, everything are all painted. When we redid it, of course, it was a dull color paint because it was faded out. The bench, which is back here, when it sat over here, the company that moved it insured, that move took about 15 minutes, they insured that move for $150,000 and weren't sure if it fell, they could replace it today. That's carved oak, it's all been fitted. The Great Seal of Indiana is up on top, and that's carved. Once a year, my staff and I take an afternoon off and we go up and relax that whole thing. Yeah, it's a lot of fun up there. I think when we did it the first time, it took about 2 days just to get the dirt off the top of it. You can imagine 100 years of accumulation on top of that. When we did the remodeling project, the cost was about $450,000 to remodel both courtrooms, redo all the painting, redo the wiring, redo the lighting, and put in an elevator. And as I recall, that was the price that we ended up paying to do everything over to get this courtroom and back courtroom so that we had a modern facility. What we attempted to do was keep it as close as we could to that which it was. Now, the jury box had been removed from here at some point in the past, and so we put it back where it was. But as you notice, if you look at circuit court, we'll turn the lights on there later, there's a big brass rail that runs in front. That's so the men can put their feet up and their boots up. The spittoons have since disappeared. Originally, there were spittoons at each end. And in fact, there were spittoons beside each podium because the attorneys would, they weren't allowed to smoke their cigars in the courtroom, but they were allowed to chew and spit. And the Supreme Court in Indiana still has those spittoons beside. The Chief Justice will tell you if you spit in it, though, you're in real trouble. They're just there for decoration. But there weren't too many ladies practicing law at that time, so most of the gentlemen did chew, and they used those. All the oak that's still in here was here originally. We didn't change anything. The stained glass that you'll see in this courtroom, in the circuit courtroom, and in Judge Doherty's upper office, and then downstairs the auditor's office still has the above. The University of Chicago came here about 12 or 13 years ago and traced all these windows. Now, those students and the people that came thought the glass was Tiffany. We do not know, nor can we find yet where it was purchased. It was brought in as part of the design of the courthouse. The paintings are real paintings. A number of years ago, somebody tried to wash one in Judge Caney's office when he was judge. Caney was washed off. And so we had to have it redone. And so in the sunshine, you can tell now that that's been washed off because the new painting is not the same. And it looks the same in the dark, and it doesn't when you see the sunlight. And in fact, when my wife and I designed the stained glass window from our house, we looked for 2 or 3 years to find a design we liked for a colonial, an old type home. We couldn't find one, and one day sitting at the bench, I thought, well, why can't we use one of these designs? And so that's the same design that we used in our house from the back window to this courtroom and on the back window to the other courtroom. The bench here, both benches are the same. If you notice, right in the middle of mine, there's a hole. When we were doing the remodeling, the guys that were doing the electrical wiring thought that'd be a great place to stick in the electrical wires, and they had that hole drilled in there before we got it stopped. But this bench is long. It's about twice as long as the one in Circuit Court. And the reason was twofold. Originally, Rensselaer was a large community, larger than anything else in the area. And it was a feeling of some of the legal people that a federal court would be stationed in Rensselaer. And federal courts had 3-judge panels. That didn't happen. It's in the federal courtroom in Lake County. What happened with this bench is it became the commissioner's court. The three commissioners would sit. And if any of you remember Harry Truman, they always said Harry Truman was a judge. That's because he was a commissioner. And a commissioner acted in commissioner's court as a judge. And they settled little disputes throughout the county. And that's what this bench was used for. All three commissioners would sit behind it. Most of the other things in here that you see are not original. The tables in the jury room are. These tables were added later. The tables in circuit court are original, and the tables in the circuit court jury room are original, together with the maple chairs. Now, the tables which belonged in here and the maple chairs, you can find them scattered out through certain homes throughout the county. How that happened, I don't know, but I will tell you that I've seen one of these tables being refinished. They're very distinctive. You can look. They're flat-foot tables, and if you see one around town, you're going to know where that table originally came from. These two desks here were in the basement of the courthouse ready for destruction. They were roll tops. And the roll tops had been taken off. That particular one was put together with 2x4s, and we sent it up to Navigable, and he reconditioned that desk and this one. So that's what they were. They're the original roll top desks that were in the courthouse, minus the roll tops. Where they went, we don't know. The one in Judge King's office, Judge Doherty's office, I think is the last roll top, fully complete in the original form that we have left in the courthouse. Other than that, that's the story of what's here. My offices are back here, and they're small. There's nothing unique about them. You're welcome to look around any of the facilities you hear while you walk through. We'll turn the lights on the circuit so you can see the original county seals in circuit courts from the Beulah Arnott. If you want a wonderful piece of paper with it, it's a great big thing, and you can see how it works. With that, I want everybody to get some refreshments, and let's start the tour. The office holders can get to their respective offices. If you want some refreshments, get some first. You're on the front line. We're right in this room here.
from the White County Museum. Now, I don't know whether I can pronounce her name correctly, but her name is Connie Cascales. Is that correct? Is that good enough? She brought me a ledger, and you remember I talked about William Donahue settling on the Pinkemink River, and there was a little town formed there called Saltillo. And it's just as you go on the Moody Road towards Francisville, just before you cross the Pinkemink, and to the right, there was this little town of Saltillo. And here is a ledger out of apparently a book, a store that was built there. And I found the names Culp and Freshauer and Davison and a lot of those names that settled up in that area. Okay, then this afternoon, Ken Brooks brought me this magazine, and it's called The Ancestry, and it is published out in Salt Lake City. And whether it has any connection with the Latter-day Saints Church out there or not, I don't know. But there is an article written by a Loretta Dennis, and it's S-Z-U-C-S. And she apparently was out at St. Joe at one time. And for the cover of their magazine, and this is a national magazine, guess what? You all recognize it, don't you? Isn't that wonderful? Okay, now the Jasper County Courthouse. You've been around and you've seen a lot of interesting things. Did they show you Benjamin Summit's marriage license? Isn't that interesting? When they showed that to me this afternoon, I said, oh, I knew him well, because I remembered that he was the Negro that General Milroy, he was then a colonel, he came into his camp, and he was ready to fight the Battle of Cheat Mountain Summit, and Ben had no last name, and so he just named him Benjamin Summit. Okay, now getting back to our courthouse. Our first county meetings were in the cabins of William Donahue and John Price. They both lived in the eastern part of the county, not far from Francisville. Later, in around 1835, they held meetings in a log cabin owned by George Spittler. Now, this is the first time we see his name, and Father Garlock's going to tell you a real interesting story next week. I hope he does. If he doesn't, I'll interrupt him and tell it myself, about Mr. Spittler. Mr. Spittler was our first county clerk. This building was a log cabin, and it is considered to be our first courthouse. And there's a picture of it on the second floor on the wall down there. Perhaps you saw that tonight. It was located a few miles south of Brook. And as I told you, Brook was Newton County. That part of Newton County was a part of Jasper County at the time. On June the 12th, 1839, the county seat was moved to the settlement at the Falls of the Iroquois, and that was then known as Newton. Until 1840, the boundaries of the county were changed several times. From that date on, they remained as they are today. The first building in the established county seat, used as a place to hold court and conduct county business, was a log house located on Cornelia Street, and that too was named after an ancestor of, I think, the grandmother of James Van Rensselaer, but it has been changed to Kellner Boulevard, if you know where that is. And the building was between Front and Van Rensselaer Streets, and the empty store building, grocery store building, is there now. This building was abandoned in very short order when it was found that it was infested with bed bugs. It was said that the Indians had lived in the building and were credited at bringing in the vermin. Mr. Van Rensselaer soon erected a courthouse at his own expense. It was a two-story frame building, 31 feet by 36, and was located on a lot east of the square on Cullen Street, about where Charlie Roberts' car lot is today. The courtroom was on the first floor with the county offices above. This building was very cold in the winter, so most of the county business was conducted from the homes of the officials. And of course, there weren't a lot of records at that time in the early days. In September of 1856, a brick structure was completed right where this one is today, on the public square. It cost $10,000. It measured 70 feet by 49 with the courtroom above and the 6 offices below. The first steps toward securing the building were taken in 1853. The plans were made but were altered many times due to the financial conditions of the country. We always have financial conditions, don't we? The original specifications called for a fireproof vault, but that was ruled out, too expensive. In the middle of the night of January the 18th, 1865, a fire broke out in this building, and before it could be put out, most of our valuable records were destroyed. It was found that the fire was a case of arson perpetrated by one Cicero Tapman, who was about 25 years old. Cicero was a boy who had been taken in by Robert H. Milroy. He taught him the ins and outs of the law business, and when the general left for the Civil War, he left his practice in the hands of his protege. Quoting from General Milroy's diary, dated January 25, 1865, we find these words. Got back to this place this evening at 5:30 p.m. Found numerous letters. Among others, one from Dwiggins giving me some particulars of the burning of the courthouse in Rensselaer, and loss of all my papers, my books, my notes, accounts, and so on. Supposed to have been fired by C.H. Tapman, who I had taken into my office as a poor boy, given him every chance, taken him in as a law partner. Finding that he was collecting money of clients and keeping it, stealing and swindling, I ordered him to turn over my papers, books, and so forth to Dwiggins. He reluctantly and slowly did so, but burned the courthouse and my papers to avoid detection of his villainy. Milroy was then stationed in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Dwiggins was a lawyer here at that time. In Mrs. Milroy's letter, she wrote of her suspicion that Tapman was not treating her right. She knew a little about the general's business, and her checks were not coming through as she thought they should. After Dwiggins and Thompson wrote of some rather shady dealings they had with Tapman, Milroy took action. We do not know whether Tapman was sent to jail, but we do think he had a trial. His father-in-law had a grocery store in Rensselaer, and the post office was in the back of the store. So Tapman had access to outgoing and incoming mail. Cicero also ran the newspaper at the time, so nothing got printed in it about the fire. What we do know is that Tapman and his family, including his father-in-law, soon left town. After the fire, repairs were made, including a vault. The cost was $954. The building was used until 1896. Some considered it to be an ugly pile of bricks, but it did serve the county for 40 years. By 1895, it became evident that there was need for major repairs if this building was to continue to serve Jasper County. Remember I said the county began to move in 1870? This growth increased the need to expand the services performed by the county officials. After much debate, it was decided to hire an architect to examine the structure to see what, if anything, could be done to patch up this building and add more space. Mr. Alfred Grindle, an architect from Fort Wayne, was employed to do the survey. He found that the walls had probably not been shored up after the fire and suffered considerable damage. The foundation was settled unevenly and was positioned so that the weight of the building came upon the inner part of the walls instead of the center, throwing the walls off plumb. The brick walls on the outside of the building were in serious condition. Mr. Grindle finally came to the conclusion that it was not practical to repair this building, that it should be replaced. On December the 10th, 1895, it was ordered by the commissioners that a new, safe, and adequate courthouse be erected on the public square. They agreed to visit some other county seats, to inspect other courthouses, and to visit some stone quarries to select a suitable stone for the structure. On February the 11th, 1896, Alfred Grindle was selected as the architect to draw the plans and specifications for the purpose of the new courthouse in Rensselaer. A contract for construction was issued to the Heinzman brothers of Noblesville, Indiana in June of that year. They gave an estimate of $89,180. There were some very strong indications that the project would be stopped by O.P. Tabor of Remington, George Bessie of Jordan Township, and Daniel Fraser of Fowler. Now, Daniel Fraser was a lawyer, and he was in this judicial circuit. And there were others on the petition. An injunction was filed, but it was taken away, and thus ended the courthouse injunction proceedings, and plans went ahead. In July of 1896, a celebration was held to say goodbye to the 40-year-old structure. Furniture was sold, and county offices moved to various places. Some of the officials were sent to jail, and that was in the newspaper. And some of them went over to the new Oddfellows building right across the street. The plans called for a building fashioned after a Victorian adaptation of the medieval Gothic form. Some of its features were its high-pitched roof, gabled dormer windows on the 4th floor, and turrets flanking the entrances. Included in the plans were the gargoyles just above the entrance on the Washington Street side. Gargoyles were an early Gothic feature introduced in 1220 as a way to eliminate corrosive rainwater from the foundations of churches. It was soon discovered that they had decorative value and were designed to ward off evil spirits. Our commissioners found that the gargoyles on our building caused a problem to those entering the courthouse on a rainy day. So a few years ago, the commissioners decided to eliminate this problem and had them plugged up. Now they stand simply as decorative features, and maybe they ward off evil spirits too. I certainly hope they do. I have often wondered if the fact that both Grindal and Weatherhog, who joined Grindal later, were originally from England, influenced the design of our building. It is the only building on which these two men ever collaborated. The construction material to be used for the exterior was to be rough-cut Bedford stone. When the stone arrived, it was discovered that what they had sent was not what the commissioners had ordered, and it was sent back. And they went to another quarry to order the stone of their choice. The building has 348,404 square feet of space, exclusive of the basement and the tower. The clock tower is 120 feet tall. Between the floors, there is a layer of clay. It is believed that this is there as soundproofing and/or fire protection. It was decided to hold the cornerstone laying on November the 12th, 1896. This was a big day for the people of Jasper County. There was a program with a speech by W. Frank Gavin, past Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge, with Prairie Lodge number 125 assisting. There was a parade, and although the city band had tried to play, they were only able to play 2 numbers because it was so cold. It was a cornet band, and so you know what their lips did to the mouthpieces. It was snowing on that day to add to this discomfort. The box placed in the cornerstone was made of copper and was welded together in the shop of William Eager, grandfather of Tim and great-grandfather of Mary Ann Meyer. Many documents were put in this box, along with pictures of recently elected McKinley and Hobart, pictures of the Rensselaer schoolhouses, the cornet band, and the old courthouse, a complete list of the judges, physicians, and lawyers, some biographical sketches of businessmen from Rensselaer and Remington, a catalog of the Rensselaer schools published in 1879 and 1880, I suppose that was the school year, with the names of all the pupils attending, and this was also included. Of course, there is a list of all the county officials and the ordinances of the city of Rensselaer. Construction continued through 1897. Mr. Weatherhog was working alone near the end of the project. He also designed our Carnegie Library and was employed to design a building at the Soldiers' Home in Lafayette, which was called the Jasper County Building. I think it has been torn down, because I was down there last summer and tried to find it, and I couldn't. But I found several new buildings on the place where I thought the building should be. In 1898, the courthouse was completed and the offices on the second floor were assigned, and to this very day are still used by those officers who have through the years replaced the ones of 1898. The courthouse is pretty much as it was originally planned, with the circuit court in the west end and the superior court in the east end, which Judge McGraw told you was the commissioner's court. The first floor has gone through many changes. There was a sheriff's office located immediately to the right of the Washington Street entrance, and somewhere near there was a holding cell for prisoners awaiting trial. The sheriff's office is no longer there, but we do have a holding cell, which is seldom used. The Civil War was still strongly remembered, and the Grand Army of the Republic was assigned a large room on the first floor for their meetings. This room is now the probation office. The Grand Army of the Republic was made up of Civil War veterans, as you probably know. They had an auxiliary made up of their wives called the Women's Relief Corps. The commissioner's records of this time show that there were several disagreements as to how this room should be used. It seems that various members of the GAR allowed other groups to meet in this room. In August of 1900, the records show that the officers of the organization came before the commissioners and asked that they specify that this room be forever dedicated to the exclusive use of the GAR. I guess they thought they were going to live forever. We still have the original GAR sign, but it's been moved to the door of the rooms used by the Veterans Administration. On June the 15th, 1898, the Women's Relief Corps asked to use the basement under the GAR room as a kitchen and dining room where they could prepare meals for money-making projects. Can you imagine women today wanting to cook on a dirt floor? They further asked for the East Courtroom, which is this one, for big meetings when they wanted to charge admission. We should have done that. Hadn't thought of that. The commissioners allowed them to do this, but whether the room was ever used for this project, I do not know. I did find where the Women's Relief Corps served the Civil War veterans a lunch after they attended the ceremonies at Weston Cemetery on Memorial Day. The courthouse is set on bedrock, and at first the basement floor was dirt. In 1981, a cement floor was poured over about half of the basement. This part is now used by the custodians, the microfilming department, and the law library. In 1982, an elevator was installed serving the first 3 floors. At one time, there was a tunnel leading to the jail from the basement of the courthouse. This was partially filled in, and the remainder is used for storage. And a few people that went to the basement probably looked into the room where the floor is still dirt, and that tunnel is back in that room, I think. We might be interested to know that the first judge to sit on the bench in the circuit court was one of the Thompson boys I mentioned earlier, Simon Parr Thompson. He supervised the furnishing of the courtroom, complete with the bench, the desk, the jury box, the witness box, the rails and the chairs, and so on and so forth. And the total cost was $2,617. Another fact that attracted my attention was that when County Clerk Perkins died in 1916, his daughter Ethel, who was his deputy, was ready to take up where her father had left off. But the powers that be at the state level would not allow her to serve in this capacity. A. Spalding Shedd was appointed, and Ethel ran the office. Later, in 1938, Simon Thompson, son of Simon P. Thompson, died in office, and his wife Helen, although she knew nothing about running the office, ran for election and was elected. So I think she resigned shortly afterwards. She was the first woman elected to be clerk of the Jasper County. Now every one of the offices on the second floor is run by a woman. Hooray. And they've all been duly elected, and Arlene Alston, our present clerk, is only the second woman to be elected to that office. The total cost of the building was $141,731.94. What would it cost to replace it today? Several million, I would presume. In June of 1983, this beautiful building, which I call Jasper County's Castle, was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Two features of the building I think worth mentioning are the stained glass windows found in several places on the second and third floors. We've been told that there is a possibility they might be Tiffany, but so far we have not been able to positively identify them as being so. And I've searched the commissioner's records, and we've looked through all the orders for buying things, and we can find all the light fixtures, we can find the outside windows, we can find the furniture, but no sign of the stained glass windows. Originally, the clock was a water clock, but was later replaced by a pendulum-type clock. It has been worked on, replaced, and we hope to have it working again soon, complete with bells tolling the hour. And we understand it's one of the few clocks like it in existence today. Our courthouse has been used for a lot of things. The square has become a public square, so to speak, and we had bond concerts on the square, and we've had our little cousin Jasper celebration. We had when Eisenhower was here, we had our celebration part of it here at the courthouse, and we had every November we have a ceremony recognizing our soldiers that have served in our country, and one of the very first one of those was the funeral of Dewey Biggs. Now you've heard Dewey Biggs' chapter of the American Legion, and it was his funeral that was held there, and he was buried in France, and his mother wanted him brought back here, and they brought him back here, had his funeral on the courthouse steps, and a horse-drawn caisson took him out to Weston Cemetery. Most of the citizens of Jasper County are proud of their building and have a great respect for those who planned it for us. In 1996, we are planning a big celebration commemorating the 100th year of the Cornerstone Laying. We hope to make this a really big bash, an occasion that the children will long remember. We are hoping to have a non-motorized parade, speeches, tours, and entertainments of all kinds. It just so happens that it was 100 years ago in the spring of 1896 that Rensselaer became a city. We are planning to incorporate a birthday party for the city in our celebration. I guess Rensselaer really was the place to be in the 1890s, and I believe it still is. And now for the rest of the story. Jasper County has had its share of floods, tornadoes, fires, murders, and robberies. In fact, disasters of all kinds, including a bank robbery and drownings, have found their way into our history. No attempt to organize any kind of fire protection was initiated until 1882. At this time, a volunteer bucket brigade was formed with Grandpa George Morgan as its leader. The first fire was one that broke out in the Leopold building, which is now Bank 1. The bucket brigade carried water from the well in the northwest corner of the courthouse and saved the building. Yes, there was a well there, complete with a windmill when the courthouse was being built. In fact, until a few years ago, there was a horse trough along the street side just west of the courthouse, and the trough was on the street side, and there was a drinking fountain on the sidewalk side. A fire department was officially established in 1888. The members were compensated as follows: exemption from military duty, exemption from jury duty, and a $500 exemption from corporation taxes on property. Any award for special efficiency was not to exceed $3. The first alarm was sounded on April the 27th, 1888, when Dr. Washburn's barn caught fire. Also in 1888, the engine house was built right where City Hall now stands. Early law enforcement was pretty much in the hands of the citizens of the county. The swamplands along the Kankakee River afforded a safe retreat for a group of criminals known as the Bandits of the Prairie. They infested the northwest portion of the county as early as 1837, engaging in horse stealing and counterfeiting. The reaction of the public was such that a group of volunteers called the Jasper Rangers was organized in 1858. It was composed of 2 men from each township. The effect was prompt, for within a year or two, the county was rid of the gang of desperados. The first jail was a 2-room log structure measuring 20 by 26 feet. It was erected in 1847 by George Spittler, with the actual work being done by W.J. Wright. Now, W.J. Wright started the undertaking and furniture business that was handed down through the generations until in 1949, when he sold the undertaking business to the Jacksons, and in the late 1970s he got out of the furniture business. The first time Mr. Spittler put a man in this jail, he broke out, and Mr. Spittler decided to change the lockup system, and then he broke out again. I guess they must have been able to use it for a while, but in 1856 it burned, and for the next 20 years Jasper County had no jail. They took their prisoners to Monticello, Lafayette, and Fowler. In 1881, the county erected a brick jail on the corner of Cullen and Harrison Streets. This building served as Jasper County's jail until 1974, when the present facility was erected and the old building torn down. Now let's get back to the people. The Van Rensselaers stayed here 10 years. But in our midst, the Yeomans, the Parkinsons, the Barclays, the Fegleys, the Thompsons, and the Wrights, and other early settlers stayed. And we have descendants of these people living among us today, and we have them here tonight. We have descendants of David Knowles. Would you please hold up your hand? If we have more than one. Okay. And then the Barclays. Do we have any of the Barclay descendants? I know we have Parkinsons. And we have, yes, there was, those 2 families got mixed up quite a bit. And then Fegleys. We have a Fegley here. And how about the Yeomans? I know there's some Yeoman descendants because they talked to me. Yes. And Culps, I don't know. One of the Culps is a commissioner now. Well, anyway. David Knowles, a lad of 12, came to Jasper County and seemed to like it well enough that he stayed. Grew up, was married, acquired farmland, built a hotel in almost the same location as the original cabin that he had helped to construct. He died in 1913 at the age of 91. His descendants are here, as are those of his sister Sarah Yeoman. I believe St. Joe has a descendant of Simon Parr Thompson on its faculty, and that's Karen Thompson Donahue, right? Mary Ellen Fisher is the great-granddaughter of Alfred Thompson. Her husband, Frank Fisher, was the architect who designed Halleck Center. You will find the Fegley name among those still contributing to the life of the county, and many descendants of John Parkinson are proud to claim Simon Kenton as an ancestor. The Randalls and the Culps, early Fork settlements, have descendants still in this area, and many of them are still active in the Methodist Church. Among those who were born here, and of whom we are mighty proud, are James F. Hanley, who gained world fame with his songs and musical scores. His hit single, Back Home Again in Indiana, sold for over 2 million copies. He wrote for numerous Broadway productions and spent a few years in Hollywood collaborating on more than 100 motion pictures. Albert Antrim, who left here to work for the Chicago Tribune, worked his way up to become managing editor. There was Tom Harmon, one of the greatest players in the history of football, was born here. He was also the father of Mark Harmon. Charlie Halleck was born in DeMotte in the northern part of the county, and he lived most of his life in Rensselaer and Washington, D.C. Edison Marshall was the author of 40 dramatic novels. His book, The Viking, was one of the four of his books developed into motion pictures. Other famous citizens who we claim, although they were not born here, I think worthy of being mentioned. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of my neighbors, Earl Reynolds. He was a world champion ice and roller skater. He was born in Battleground, Indiana, and moved to Rensselaer when he was 6 years old. His wife, Nellie Donegan, who was born in Australia, performed with Earl in the Ziegfeld Follies. She was of a theatrical family, and Earl taught her to skate. She replaced Anna Held in one of the Follies. Nellie has 2 daughters, twins, whom Earl took in as his own. The family skated together for a number of years. They appeared in vaudeville, circuses, nightclubs, and hotels. They once skated for the King and Queen of England, a command performance. Maudie and Helen, the twins, eventually started their own skating acts. Maudie took to the ice skating, and Helen continued as a roller skater. Helen lives here today, just across the street from me. She remains quite active in spite of her 93 years. Living with her is Patty Lemaire, Maudie's daughter, who also skated. She was born in Rensselaer. Now we come to General Robert H. Milroy, who was born in Washington, Indiana in 1816, the same year Indiana became a state, a fact which he liked to boast. He came to Rensselaer from Delphi, Indiana in 1854, 4 years after receiving his law degree from Indiana University. He had graduated from a military school in the East and had several degrees. He was said to have been the most educated general in the Civil War. He also gained fame as a recruiter. We were so proud of our general that in 1910 the statue of him, standing so imposingly in Milroy Park, was erected. This triangle of ground was the site where the Milroy home stood. And this concludes my part of this series. Thank you.